dare I say to all of us, Merry Christmas. Oh, I don't know if it's too soon yet, but it is December. The Christmas jumpers are on. I can see around the room there's a smattering of snowflakes and woolly jumpers. Christmas is coming. And I think that this Christmas, for many of us, Christmas will feel quite different. Perhaps you're spending it with different people or you're in a different place. I'm really excited for Christmas this year because hopefully by then I'll have my own daughter by then, and hopefully she'll be as cute and as good looking as Ella and as well behaved and quiet as Ella. That would be dreamy, wouldn't it? But whatever the case, one thing will be different for all of us this Christmas. So I'm not sure if whether you've clocked this or realized it yet, but there won't be a Queen's speech on Christmas Day. But presumably, there'll be a King's speech instead. And for those of us that grew up watching Queen Liz every Christmas, addressing the nation, I think it'll just be a bit odd, won't it, to see Charlie in her place. I don't know how you're feeling about that, but I know that my grandparents are certainly feeling quite nervous about it. And perhaps rightly so. Because I think all of us feel a sense of angst whenever a new leader is in charge, particularly when it's one whose life has been so well documented and has not always been that popular. It'll be interesting to see if the mood music around him changes in the new year. We'll have to wait and see. I think our sense of angst is driven by the fact that sadly, we're all too often so familiar with stories of leaders failing us. And worse still, we fear what those with power may do with it. Whether that's Putin in Ukraine or Elon Musk taking over Twitter or people that we know ourselves. And yet, on the flip side, there's rarely ever a call for the complete abandonment of leadership altogether, is there? That's been tried and found wanting. Rather, we call for better leaders and more of them. Whenever a team is performing poorly at a sport, say at the World Cup, usually the reason cited is because there's a lack of leadership on the pitch. Or when you're at work and it's getting difficult and the workload is piling up, or you're at school and the work just seems impossible and the maths questions unsolvable, in those moments, the thing that we crave is better leadership, more guidance, someone to show us the way, to guide us, to show us the way through. I mean, we've all seen, haven't we, the chaos that we're left with when politicians in our own country abandon their duty to plan parties and pretend to be celebrities in jungles, and the chaos that we're left with when it seems that leaders are changing every other month. It's deeply unsettling. You see, I think we all, to some degree, feel this sense of angst or nervousness about leadership, and yet there's something in us that craves it all the same. There's this ongoing dance in our culture and in our own hearts between wanting leadership and I think realizing that to do so, we have to cede authority to somebody else that we can trust. And often, we want to lead on our own terms. I think all of us, in one way or another, can all be a little bit like Ryan from the US Office, if you've seen that series. And in a famous episode, he says these words. He says, I want guidance. I want leadership, but don't just boss me around. Lead me when I'm in the mood to be led. Lead me when I want to be led, when I'm in the right place. Do what I want to do. See, we desire good leaders, but rarely find them or follow them. So what are we to do? Well, as we have a new king on the throne in this country this Christmas, we're going to start a new series tracing the theme of kingship through the Bible, ultimately finding its conclusion in Jesus, the King of Kings. And we're going to be asking this question today: what kind of king do we all want this Christmas? I'm going to start by going right back to Deuteronomy 17, what we've read, and one of the first mentions of kingship in the Bible, before we have a slight glance at Isaiah 9 towards the end. But we're going to see three things this morning, or I hope we're going to see three things this morning. Firstly, we're going to see the desire for kingship. Secondly, the danger of kingship. And thirdly, the demands of kingship, before seeing Jesus, the King of Kings. Well, firstly, the desire of kingship from verses 14 and the start of 15. I don't know what you think of the idea of us having a king in this country, in this day and age, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But certainly, when it comes to kings in the Bible, if you know the story of the Old Testament, I think we immediately wince. When we read the accounts of their life and rule, we see all their faults and their failures in vivid color. And if we do know the story of the Old Testament, then we'll know, too, that when Israel did appoint their first ever king, a man named Saul, they did so because they were rebelling against God. They no longer wanted God to be in charge, but wanted a man to be in his place. You see, we tend to think of kingship in the Old Testament as a bad thing. And for the most part, that's right. But it has always been God's plan to raise up a king who would lead and rule over his people ever since his promises at the start of Genesis. And here in Deuteronomy 17, we hear in great detail how the king of Israel ought to rule. See, the passage that we read is a segment of some law, some civil law given by God to his people. The Israelites have been led out of Egypt and they're on the journey towards the promised land. And Moses is now reading to them the laws that the Lord has provided them to help them to live among the nations in their newfound freedom. The people have not yet reached the promised land. They're on the way there. And they won't appoint a king for the next couple of centuries. So it's interesting then that hundreds of years before they get there, we find decrees about kingship. I want to wonder why that is. You see, I think it's as though the Lord, in his kindness, is preempting the people's eventual cry for a king by laying down the groundwork, giving them permission, but also laying down some safeguarding measures that will help them not have corrupt leaders. It's clearly time-bound. It's for when the people enter the land, when they have taken possession of it and settled in it. You see, the king is only meant to rule once they've reached where they're going. No ruler is allowed to rise up and take them off in a different direction. The Lord is taking them to the promised land. And it's clear that the Lord is to remain in control. If you flick your eyes back down to it, he is the one that is taking them to the promised land. He is to be actively involved in the appointment of the king that the people will choose. At this point in time, the Lord isn't relinquishing or care and concern for his people. Far from it. And he has every right to be the one to help them choose who to be king, because he is the one who has saved them from slavery and the one who is gifting them the new land, a new home. The people should want God to remain in control because he's good and all that he's done for them. So the question arises, why do they want a king? Why will they eventually cry out and desire somebody to rule over them other than God directly? Well, the Lord knows that one day they will say, let us have a king over us like all the other nations around us. Their demand for a king is driven by a desire to fit in, to be like the other nations around them. They see all these big, powerful, mighty nations around them, and they feel that they don't quite fit in, and they want a taste of it. They want to fit in. They see that all these mighty, powerful nations seem to have mighty, powerful leaders, and so they want one. You know, you can imagine them talking amongst themselves. Remember back in Egypt, they had that big, mighty leader, that Pharaoh guy, and that was quite cool. Maybe we should have one. We need one too. They want a slice of the action. They want to fit in. And yet, there's a hint of tragedy already here, because God's people were never meant to fit in. In fact, one of the very reasons why God had saved them from Egypt was so that they would stand out, to live distinctly amongst the nations, so that other people would see how great and glorious and brilliant God is. Israel was meant to act like a lighthouse for God, not one of the many ships in the sea. Their life was to testify to his saving hand. And suddenly, despite being hundreds of years ago and hundreds of miles away, don't they just sound a bit familiar? Isn't it a desire to fit in with those around us that means that we too often take our gaze from God? Isn't it often a misdirected desire to be liked by others, to look more impressive in front of friends and colleagues, to feel powerful, that means that we so often shy away from following Christ? Perhaps you're feeling that in your own heart as you think about carols coming up next week and the Nativity Trail and wanting to invite people along, but just finding that hard. To live distinctly, to follow God, leaves us feeling just a little bit odd and out of sorts. And so we readily trade the saving hand of our God for a thumbs up from others. Yet, like the Israelites, fitting in is never quite enough. See, we always want more than just to fit in. Whenever I've been recently creating a wish list for Christmas on Amazon, and I kind of know vaguely what I want to put on the wish list, but as I scroll through, oh my eyes just see other things, and my heart just gets greedy, and there's other things that suddenly I'm grabbing and I'm pulling onto my wish list, and I would love it if somebody would get me this and this and this. Well, Israel and we too are greedy. Because if we find out, actually, if we were to look, they didn't just want to fit in. The Israelites also wanted a taste of power. See, when they do eventually install a king, later on in the story in 1 Samuel, it's interesting why they do it. They say, we want a king over us. Then we will be like the other nations, with a king to lead us, and then they say, and so we can go out, a king who will go out before us and fight our battles. See, they add a bit. It's not just so that they'll be like the nations. It's so that they can have a king who will fight for them and beat other nations. They add that they want a king who will fight their battles, who will win wars and make them mighty. Not that they want to get their hands dirty. They want to sit back. They want a king who will fight for them. And in doing so, they take the good decrees of God, the things that he has given permission for, the things that God has said they can do, and they add a bit, twisting it to their own benefit. And hasn't that been the story ever since the start, up until today? We hear what God has to say about X, Y, Z, and we say, yeah, but what about A, B, C? What about this? Surely you've said that, but really you don't mean it that way, surely. Or you've said that, but maybe I can get away with this. It's always been the story that we add to what God says. We twist God's rules, thinking that they won't break, without realizing that we're actually breaking ourselves. You see, God is good and his ways are good. His law is life-giving. And so to live any other way is actually to diminish ourselves. Like swimmers in a pool who desire for the pool to be a bit larger, so we get a sledgehammer and start knocking down the walls. We think we're making the pool bigger when actually we're causing the water to run out. We think we're making the pool bigger when actually we just cause a flood. You see, what kind of king do we want this Christmas? Well, like Israel here, I think that in truth, we often want a king who just won't interfere with our lives. They and we want a God who will allow us to do whatever we please, to lay low, to fit in. I think that's in large part why we've become comfortable with sidelining the true meaning of Christmas to the background. If not with our lips, then at least with our actions, other things take priority at this time of year. And so often the nativity story is often reduced to the tinsel on top of the present rather than the present itself. But to want a king like that is dangerous. As we'll see in verse 14 to 17, the dangers of kingship. It's dangerous to want a king like that. That's why in his kindness, the Lord decrees and places in safeguards to protect his people from danger. For starters, the king must be one of their own. Did you notice that? He must be an Israelite. That's kind of doubly emphasized. You can't really miss it. If the people are to remain distinct, then they can't draft in a manager from another country. They need a leader that resembles the people, a king in their own image that knows the story of their rescue from Egypt, a king who knows their God. This is then followed by 3 safeguarding measures. Firstly, the king must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself. meaning he must not accrue military power and might for himself. He can't build himself an army and live for power. Secondly, he must not take many wives, meaning that he can't live for his own sexual fulfillment or to gain power through strategic marriages. And thirdly, he must not accumulate large amounts of wealth in silver and gold, meaning that he mustn't store up riches for himself and live for money. You see, ever since the very first kings, the problems of power, sex, and money have always been the pitfalls and dangers of leadership. I mean, isn't that the story of history, the long line of leaders who have failed in this area and got it wrong, who put their own interests and desires above those of the people they lead? Yet do you see the kindness of the Lord in how he preempts this, how he lays this down ahead of time before the people even ever have a king? He lays down the law. He knows the human heart more than anybody else, and he doesn't want his people to be led astray. So he lays down how they're to live for him. You see, the great sadness and irony is that to have a leader that lives for these things, ultimately for himself, is as good as returning to slavery in Egypt. That is, a king that was held captive by his own selfish and sinful desires will make slaves of his own people. The people would be no freer than they were should they have remained under Pharaoh. And remember, they're meant to live differently. They're meant to be beacons shining out to others. But here's the other sad irony and danger. If you've seen the latest series of The Crown, I'm a big fan, and I think it returned to its best in the latest series. But if you've seen it, then you'll be familiar with the theme that runs throughout the drama, as to whether royalty is meant to be distinct and separate to the culture of the society it governs, or whether it's meant to reflect and reinforce the changing will of the people. The sad reality is that we often end up with broken leaders because we are broken people. That's not to say if you've ever suffered at the hands of a bad leader that that's your fault, but it is to say that broken people become broken leaders, and broken people follow broken people. We end up with leaders who are slaves to their selfish desires because we are slaves to our own selfish desires. See, we all, in one way or another, at various times and places, are often pulled by the lure of sin, more often than not in the same traps warned of here in Deuteronomy 17, by power, sex, or wealth. Another show, a reality TV show that was on not too long ago, I didn't see it, I don't know if it was any good. It was called Make Me Prime Minister on Channel 4. I don't know whether you have seen it, but the idea was that everyday people did various tasks to show how they would make a better prime minister than whoever was prime minister at the time that was airing. It probably changed a number of times. But it played on the fact that they were all very good at playing armchair politician or boss or football manager or whoever it is that we wish were in their position. And I didn't see the results, but I do know that it's slightly foolish to assume that we would do any better. Now, there might be bits of it that we'd be better at. I mean, for lots of us, there might be lots of areas that we'd be much better at. But we'd be forced to think that we wouldn't ever face the same dangers or traps or pitfalls. We're not impervious to the same problems that our leaders face. And that's why it's important then that we pray for our leaders. It's important where we're able to ensure that our leaders have sufficient accountability, but it's also why we need to pray for ourselves and pray for our own hearts and ensure that we have sufficient accountability, that we should all together seek to flee the dangers of sin. So the question is, who are the people in your life? Who are the people in church that you can talk to about your struggles, the things where sin is lurking? Who are the people that you can be weak and vulnerable with? You see, all too often we can act like Christmas trees. We can decorate ourselves up, look all shiny and pretty, when in reality, all the pine needles are falling off. Who are the people that you can talk to, that you can be open with? If you don't have somebody right now, perhaps you could start by talking to your community group leader if you're a regular member of Grace Church. See, what kind of king do we want this Christmas? I hope we're beginning to see something of the problem. The people require a king who is one of their own, who reflects them, and yet we need a king who remains utterly holy, and so is different to them. And here we come to the demands of kingship, verse 18 to 20. You see, what is the king to do? How is he, and in turn the people, meant to live distinctly? Well, firstly, if we look back down at those verses, 18 to 20, he is to love the law of God. He is to write down a copy of the whole law. That's the whole of Deuteronomy that Moses has been putting forward. He's to write it all down. If you've ever got handache whilst writing an exam or writing endless Christmas cards to distant relatives that you'll never see, take a moment's pity for this king who is to write down the whole of the law. And yet it won't just be his duty. He won't be doing it because he has to, but he'll be doing it because it's his delight. He's to have the law with him at all times and to read it every day. He's to soak it in. He's to absorb it. He's to be like a sponge. He's to be wrung through with the law of the Lord so that out of him pours reverence for God. He is to hunger for God and to hang on his every word, carefully following all that he says. You see, to revere and to follow are usually the realms and demands of servants, not kings. These are usually words that kings tell other people to do. Revere me, follow me. And yet we find here that this is what the king is to do. He is to revere and he is to follow God. The king is to realize that he is not the one who's truly ever in charge and instead devote himself to the ruler of the cosmos. His puny, pokey throne is nothing compared to the grand throne that God sits on in heaven. His puny, pokey throne has been gifted to him by a divine hand. And so he is in turn to praise and thank God for everything that he has. Thank the true king. His rule, his land, his very life is a gift from God. And this God is good. He's not a divine dictator in the sky, but a king who longs for his people to not be led astray and to know the joy of living in his perfect freedom and love. And knowing this is to radically transform how the king views himself and others. You see, despite his crown, he's not meant to look down on anybody else. In fact, he's meant to look up to God. By looking up to God, he cannot look down on anybody else. He's to be a humble king, one of the people. And if that sounds radical to you and me, and impossible to you and me, well, it was completely countercultural back then in the ancient Middle East, all the more. See, how is the king to live humbly? Well, we're told, aren't we? He must not turn from the law to the left or to the right. His gaze is to be laser focused, straight ahead, always on God's law. Now, if you know me, you'll know that I'm quite into my DIY. I like to be quite handy around the house. But for a long while, I didn't have the correct tools. And so I'd find myself kind of cutting through long bits of wood with puny, pokey tools that were never really meant to do the job. And I'd have to focus all my attention to try to keep it straight and not go wonky and end up with doors that were just wonky at the bottom. And you see, when you're cutting through, just 1 millimeter to the left or to the right would cause a wonky cut and the door would no longer fit or whatever it is working on. See, following God is to remain central to all that the king does, to be steady, consistent, faithful. It's a lofty calling that the king is to follow. And in doing so, the king is to be an example to all the people and to us, leading them in their devotion to God. This is what good and proper leadership looks like, pointing people beyond ourselves to the true king above. Ultimately, that is what will ensure his kingdom lasts a long time, bringing peace and stability. And we're to follow that example too. We are to love the Lord, to hunger after his word, to devote ourselves to one another. And so I have to ask, does that sound like you? I don't think it sounds like me most of the time. Or if you're honest, does it actually just sound a little bit boring and just a little bit basic? Like you've heard all that before, just kind of stay steady. Well, you would be somewhat right, but I definitely wouldn't call it boring. The author, G.K. Chesterton, compared remaining faithful and staying the course of faith as like one big swashbuckling adventure. In a world that is constantly shifting and changing and flip-flopping from side to side, to remain steady and not go with the tide of what culture is saying is one of the most exciting things possible. He says, this is the thrilling romance of orthodoxy. People have fallen into a foolish habit of speaking of orthodoxy as something heavy, humdrum, and safe. But there was never anything so perilous or so exciting as orthodoxy, as keeping the course of the faith, keeping going with the Lord. He says it's perilous and exciting. Now, why? Why does he say that? Well, to remain steady and centered on God's word, to love him and his people, is going to be uncomfortable. To be led by God and what he says, rather than to sway from side to side, but to let him lead us wherever he pleases, means that we will go to places that we would more readily avoid. He's going to confront us with truth that we would rather ignore and bury. To let him lead and to cede authority to him is going to be difficult, but worth it because he's good. And just as he's taking the people to the promised land back then, so too he's taking us now, if we believe in him, to the promised future with him forever. See, what kind of king do we want this Christmas? Well, we know, don't we, that just as the kings will eventually mess up, so do we. We don't live up to our own expectations, let alone all those being spelled out here. You see, we need a king who is one of us, who is human, but is completely upright. One who can rule with humility and utter holiness. Well, as we come near to the end, praise God for the Christmas story. Because it's into this backdrop that passages such as Isaiah 9, which we're going to read in a moment, bring piercing hope. As we get to Christmas, we see the true King, Jesus, the one who not only fulfills all that our passage points towards, but does so by flipping it on its head altogether. He's not only the king who never turns from the left or the right, but he is God himself, the king who stoops down into the human story from heaven to the stable. He is the leader with complete authority that we can completely trust. He is the truly promised and chosen one by God. He is a leader who doesn't have to use a megaphone from up high to demand what we do, but one who can whisper as he's down with us in the trenches. He's a leader who knows what it's like to live under oppressive regimes and corrupt leaders, yet never lashes out in contempt or festers away with cynicism. He's the leader who resists all temptations of power, sex, and wealth, who meets our deepest desires for true belonging, who flees all dangers of sin and meets all the demands of holiness. He's the king who delights with his every moment in obeying God's every word. He's the king who brings joy to the nations. He doesn't want to just let his people fit in with them, but to bless the nations. He's the king who brings light into the darkness. He's the king who brings peace and relief from suffering. He is the truly mighty one, whose power is displayed through him who is the Prince of Peace. He is the king who will reign forever with perfect justice and righteousness. He's the king who comes to gather his people together so that we might not be led astray, but he's guiding us, taking us home to our true promised land. He's the king that we can all trust and follow today and forevermore. Jesus is the King of Kings. Throughout this series, as we get closer to Christmas, we're going to be following that story more and more and see more and more of Jesus and how wonderful and brilliant he is. But I'm going to read the passage from Isaiah 9 now, and as I do so, I'm going to invite the band to come up and lead us in our next song. But here's what Isaiah 9, verses 2 to 7 has to say. A familiar passage that's read out at Christmas. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. Amen.